We're live. Hey to all the listeners. This is Ryan Bauckham. I'm here with Pastor Larry Bauckham and Brett Watson, and we are discussing Hello World. Just finished up our first week, about to move into week 2. And Pastor, could you go ahead and give us a summary of week 1?
Sure. Last week we looked at the first chapter of Genesis, and we talked about the beginning. In the beginning, Bereshit bara Elohim et Shamayim va'aretz, and I love the Hebrew in that, particularly because when you memorize languages or you learn languages, one of the things you do is that you basically sub-vocalize the words. It's hard to memorize a language without that. So one of my favorite words in Genesis is Bereshit, and you know what it sounds like. So I know it's sad, but that's how you remember things.
No, it's just funny.
That's how I remember things.
Yeah.
So
how do you go about remembering your headphones?
Yeah, well, that's a different story.
Okay.
Thanks for putting those on. I felt weird.
No, it's cool.
So, but anyways, last week we talked about in the beginning. This is the first creation account of Genesis, and it was try to give a quick summary of what it meant. But Genesis chapter 1 is about the creation, and the summary is God is good. I mean, he creates all these things, and it's good. There was evening, there was morning, day 1, evening, morning, day 2, and it's very poetic. And last week we talked about how the importance of Genesis 1 is to understand it as poetry, not necessarily, or poetic prose, not necessarily as a historical, political information. Mm-hmm. So that was kind of good. And we talked about the major themes of the Spirit of God, the Ruach of God, as it breathed over the waters, and he hovered there, and when he spoke, order began to be created out of the darkness. We talked about the deep. We talked about the storms and the chaos of our lives, and how there still can be order spoken into our lives today. So that same Spirit is alive and well, and still transitions the chaotic moments of our lives into some kind of order. So that was kind of the summary, concluding with some stories about being on the Sea of Galilee and the storms, and even with Jesus, speaking, and the storm calms. So that's kind of the summary of last week. And this week we jump into chapter 2. So
the second origin story in the Bible.
Right, and the second origin story is really much simpler, in my opinion. He just gives it, the count of heaven and the earth, and he just goes through. God created, there's no shrubs, there's no rain, the water comes from the bottom, and from the earth it doesn't seem like it flows down from the heavens. And again, it's a second creation, very summary, but then we get into Adam, and then it gets more significant.
So let me ask something real quick. What has been your process for working on the second part? You said you were up early this morning. I didn't catch whether you were working on this all morning or...
Yeah, I was. It's been fun to get in this because it's pushed me back into my Hebrew Bible. And I read Hebrew, but I haven't read it in a while. I get a little rusty, but once I get in, the vocabulary comes back alive, the reading becomes easier, and I begin to see all these nuances. There are play on words in the ancient language that we don't get in English, mm-hmm. and we don't see them. And we're reliant on the translator to give us what they think, and sometimes what they think is not what I think. Some of the best translation, and that's why different translations have different nuances. Mm-hmm. But I like it.
But you were also saying, and I don't know if this was at the weekend or if this was in our kind of planning session beforehand, but you were saying something about how you have to vocalize a lot of these words. You can't just read them. You have to almost vocalize them in order to get back into it.
Yeah, in Hebrew, you read from right to left. There are no vowels typically in what you read. And some of the Masoretic text, which is called the Hebrew Bible, has little dots. And these dots are symbolic of vowels. And you have to know the vowel carriers and those kinds of things. But it's hard to read the language. And if you just look at all these symbols, I don't know anyone who could memorize Hebrew or basically any language by looking at the letters. You have to say those. And you sub-vocalize, like I use the word, Bereshit. I read Elohim or Yerushalayim. All these words are Shema, Israel. I mean, these words, as you read them, your brain does not memorize the sticks and curves. Your brain memorizes what those sounds, how those sounds are produced, which is interesting because in sub-vocalizing, you're really speaking this under your breath, and it comes to life. and so the text comes alive as you speak it in some measure, or you can't even in memorization. That's what linguists would say.
Yeah. There's I don't remember where I saw this, but I read something about the importance of oral tradition for that reason, that it etches it in the memory differently than when you read language.
Yeah, and the same thing is true in songs. Mm-hmm. You sing a song, and you memorize the song. It's got some lyrics that go, the lyrics are tuned to music, and so is poetry. Two roads diverged in a yellow wood, and there I stood. You get this poetic, and the same thing is in Hebrew. And there was evening and there was morning, day one. There was evening, there was morning, and it's this memorization of these stories, and they put them in some kind of meter, so that our brains can understand that, at least orally. That's the way they do it.
It's interesting that it translates at all to the English language. I mean, you would imagine that reading the original Hebrew would be completely different in the rhythm and meter than it would be in the English.
It is different.
It is, yeah.
That's
but it translates at all, that you can get any kind of, you can kind of feel it a little bit. I mean,
as you read it in Hebrew, you hear it, but sometimes, unless it's a good translation, you don't hear it in the English at all. So and part of the language is and in Genesis 1 they did that, and there was evening, there was morning, day one. But even a lot of the Psalms, they repeat the Psalm, blessed is the man who does this, and then they repeat it in another way, and it's parallelism. Yeah, and they repeat it, but these were songs, they were sang, and you said it twice for emphasis, and you said it in a different way, so your brain would understand that you got it right. Mm-hmm.
I've also heard that in these oral traditions that their brains actually were almost wired differently. Yeah. That they had a different way of thinking than we do, because they weren't reading and writing like we do.
And their memories were better.
Yeah, this I do know, that in reading and studying Hebrew, it rewired my brain. And I can't explain that except to say
I was going to say, what do you mean by that exactly?
You think a little different.
It explains some things.
Yes, it does. Yeah, and maybe it never been wired in the first place. But in reading from right to left, there's something that happens in your brain that it begins to connect different levels, and it's more Semitic thought. And the gutturals that you use rather than the normal. I mean, Shema Israel, Yahweh Elohim, Echad Elohim. I mean, these are things that you begin to say, well, what does that mean? And it means, hear, O Israel, the Lord your God, the Lord is one. But as you begin to read from right to left, and something happens, and it's hard for me to describe it, but it's like I think a little bit differently. I connect a little more to this ancient culture, so it seems.
Yeah.
Just from reading their language, and the real ideal of any scholarship or understanding is to put yourself in the first century if you're reading first century text, and if you're reading these ancient Genesis things. I mean, you got to go way back and say, this is before even writing. There was no writing, and these stories were told. And how would I tell them around a campfire? How would I tell them to my kids? Mm-hmm. We don't use that mechanism as much anymore because we have books and literature, but it's a different form, and you have to understand that form because it was used often in worship services.
And the power of something like that after generations and generations of telling these stories, I mean, they would kind of shift in some way, right? I mean, maybe not. Maybe they're completely the same. Somebody authored this story, but I feel like they would become more and more true to the kind of the human experience and the human psyche. It slowly evolve in some way into a more true and real part that resonated with people.
I think the genius of the primordial stuff, Genesis 1 to 11, is their mythological form makes them subject to interpretation so much easier than something that's more specific. So I don't think they had to change too much for that reason, but the interpretations of these stories over time will change, and they'll gain more meaning, I think.
But I think even as they were written, though, there's a lot of scholarship that would say this is not one writer. This was many writers writing over many generations. And the Graf Wellhausen theory, guy that basically said if you study and look at the way the word God is used, for example, you'll see that In Genesis 1, it's Elohim, but in Genesis 2, it's Yahweh Elohim. And they're saying these are different documents or different schools that someone redacted or editors, a better word, some editor came in and seamed these together to where they're really a preservation of two great schools of thought, or maybe two great lines of stories, and they put them into one to make them all in one written form.
So in these two stories, Genesis 1 and Genesis 2, they think are reflective of the northern kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom?
I don't know northern and southern. I mean, there's a theory along that line because of exile and coming back from exile, that the north went into exile and the south went into exile a couple hundred years apart, 1722, 1586. But when they came back together, they brought their stories back, and the schools of thought tried to say, well, as it shifted as it would for a couple hundred years, and from the north and south, these editors melded both stories together and seen them together. That is one primary form of thought, but not everybody buys anything, you know. So
how do we know for sure anyway?
No, but that's the greatest probability, and I think the majority of scholarship would agree with that.
I mean, when you look at these two stories, the order of creation is different.
Sure.
So they clearly come from different origin stories, different sources rather, and the fact that God is named differently from one story to the next suggests that too.
Right.
Yeah, it is interesting.
Those are called literary critics. So literary criticism, which would be Graf Wellhausen, would say there's these different literature sources that put together to make this happen. So, and it's
and what kind of critic are you? I mean, your background in what, critical methodology?
Yeah, my PhD is from Florida State University, and it's actually in humanities with a concentration in historical critical methodology. So I'm very versed in form criticism, redaction criticism, literary criticism, new literary criticism. I mean, all these critical methodologies that are basically scientific approaches to any literature, and they applied it to the Bible, and they began to be able. It helps us understand more authentically what they were trying to say. I mean, wouldn't it be a lot better to say, well, this is what it says, but it's much better to say, okay, but 2,000 years ago in that culture, this meant something different than what we read it today.
Yeah.
Because it had impact. You got to put it in context. Who said it? Where were they? What was going on? What was the culture? What wars? What were the religious situation? And then this has a greater meaning. So in good biblical interpretation, we want to leave a lot of the culture behind, but bring the theological truths that are true for all times back to the future. So it's not that we want to turn everybody
and the ability to. I'm sorry, I cut you off there.
So we don't want to bring a lot of the debris from the past and try to turn people today into a culture of 2,000 years ago. We're not trying to convert people into ancient Jewish people. We want them to understand these great truths that have survived for generation after generation, still can be applicable to our lives today. And I think that's good teaching, honest, authentic teaching.
And understanding that history and the context in which these were written also helps us to then apply those truths to our own context better.
Right. And the real scary part is trying to be as objective as possible, because we all have presuppositions. We all come in with a certain jaded, I'm a Western person, I'm not Eastern, and come in and read. I read automatically through Western lenses. I read through capitalism. I read as American. And how do I let myself be laid bare or take off all those layers of presupposition? And I think when I can do that and go back then and try to see it as they did, I can more readily grasp the authentic truth. So
you've been studying. You said you started reading Genesis 2 today.
Yeah, 2 and 3.
For the first time ever.
No,
It was the first time that you picked it up?
No, many years ago I translated all of Genesis from I did my own translation from Hebrew to English, and I've done also Deuteronomy and some other books as well. I mean, parts of books, but those 2 books in fully.
Sounds like so much fun.
Oh, it's a joy.
I think it does sound fun.
It's work. It's work, but it's gratifying.
Yeah.
Brett would think it was fun. I'm sorry, Brett. I didn't mean to. So
Take that as a compliment.
I figured you would. So talking about Genesis 2, what were some of the things that stuck out to you as you read through that? You were kind of saying there was a lot of things this morning that were jumping out and that you saw as reoccurring themes throughout the rest of the Bible that were kind of bringing up thoughts.
Yeah. As I read this again, what it's like things that you've forgotten, but you once knew. And all of a sudden they come back to your memory and go, oh, I knew this, but I'd just forgotten it. And those are great treasures in there. And also just the analysis, this is the account of the heavens and earth when they were created. God made heaven and earth. That's easy. But then they start talking about the breath. God breathes into man. And the literal word there for Adam, in Hebrew, Adam means ground or dirt. So God breathes into the dirt. And that's just pretty significant, but the value is not in the dirt, the value is in the breath. And he became a living person. And really the word there, living person, is nephesh, which means soul or lifeblood. And sometimes we don't get that in English. I always say he's a living person, but these concepts of breath and blood, you take away someone's breath, you suffocate them. You take away their blood, they're dead. These are two ingredients for life. And when he gives him the breath, he becomes this blood-filled. And another word for nephesh, is the Hebrew word, is soul. So he's a person that now has blood or life or soul. In the translation, he becomes a living being. But it really is much more detailed than that. Mm-hmm. At least it can be presented that way. So
I love that imagery, too, in this chapter because of the intimacy, at least as I see it when I read it. It's as though the picture that I get in my mind is that, God takes this earth and I picture him cradling Adam's head and moving in close to breathe his life into him. And I just, and maybe that's my own slant and my own need for intimacy with God, but I think that's
No, I like that. That's cool.
a beautiful way to envision it.
When he breathes in that, then all of a sudden there's the word inspiration that has to come out of there somewhere, because there's been, that's a breath word. Mm-hmm. When you expire, you die. So, that's when you breathe your last. But when you're inspire, it's kind of like you breathe your first. And it gives a whole lot of more insights into the concept of even, hey, I was inspired for this art, or I was inspired, and it's really
like you received something that's
like,
living.
Yeah, something somewhere comes into you and you get this insight or aha moment, and you're able to do something creative. And our creative team here they definitely are inspired. And if I had to do it, I would be expired. So it's something that's those moments that I think are amazing. And I think this word is significant for that too.
Yeah.
So there's some.
So last week you focused on the ruah, which I'm not going to say it, attempting to do the Hebrew thing there, but
just clean off the mic after you're done.
And that was kind of the thing that we focused on when we were planning last week. And this week you feel like that word for blood or soul or whatever it is significant. But it seems that a lot of times these things come in threes, especially in the Jewish tradition or in the Christian tradition, especially in the Christian tradition with the Trinity and all of that. So is there a third part that comes in to play, or is it just those two that are kind of the key aspects of life in early humanity?
Well, I'm sure there are at least three. I mean, there are other Hebrew words of significance. One in Deuteronomy is me'od, which means strength. I mean, all your heart, levav, all your soul, nephesh, and all your strength. But I think those are other words that could come in. But I think, we look at these threes, and I don't want to just look for a third to make it a third. But I think as we go through, we'll find it, and we'll see it. And part of this exploration is to say, well, I wonder, Let's don't miss it.
Well, was there a third component that would be essential to life? I mean, breath obviously being one. Blood, there's been a lot of significance in blood in Christianity, obviously with the sacrifice, the Old Testament sacrificial system, and then moving into even the time of Jesus, and Paul talks about blood all the time, and there's a lot of talk of blood. So that has to do with life as well. But is there anything else in these stories that jumps out at you that you would say have to do with kind of the fundamentals of human life?
Yeah, for me, I would think the next one, at least this in my just initial observation, might be awareness. So there's this because without brain, you really aren't functional either. So you have the life, the breath, and you have the blood, but all of a sudden there's this mental component, which is the seat of intellect for the Hebrew was in the gut, not in the head.
Yeah.
Because you just that's the seat of your emotions.
Which is weird because we know now more about like the importance of your gut bacteria and how it regulates so much of your emotions.
And not only that, but the neural system in the heart and in the gut that stands alone. Actually, it has its own kind of intelligence.
Yeah.
So that it can function.
It's funny. I mean, it's been a thing for obviously a long time, like listen to your gut and, like feel your gut instinct and all that. But to find out now that there's so much more there than just a metaphor.
And the thing, they were talking about this thousands of years ago, that, because you feel it, when you feel queasy, you don't feel it in your head, or, you feel fear, you don't feel it in your head.
No.
You feel it in your abdomen. So, but I think that'd be, which ties into this chapter real well. So, here we are, Adam and Eve, Adam's in the garden. The garden's created, and then Adam's created, and then Eve comes along too, which is another side story along that, which is interesting too, but because there's not many stories that talk about women being created. So this is one of the few.
You mean like early stories?
Ancient stories.
Ancient stories.
Yeah, usually it's just men. We don't, back then women were not as important, but here it is interesting that the value of women in this early creation story, I think, is something significant to point out. But in the garden, when we look in the garden, all of a sudden there's this, they're challenged with the tree in the garden.
Yeah.
In the center of the garden, there are not, I like to ask the question, how many trees were in the middle of the garden and what was it? And people would say, one. It's the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. But the answer is actually two, because there's a tree of life. And this is other interesting. They could have eaten from the tree of life. It wasn't a forbidden fruit. But, but they didn't. But my question is, here's this story, and within this story, there's this garden created, and in the middle of the garden, God plants a tree of knowledge of good and evil and tree of life, and he tells man, he puts on this tree, and it's described, the fruit looked good. It was desirable, it looked delicious, and it would make me smarter. Why wouldn't I take of this fruit? And you begin to see this third component. I need to make a choice, and that's where the intellect comes in. It's not about my breath, it's not about my blood, it's a choice I make. Now, I look at this, and of course I ask the argumentative questions that annoy me if somebody else asks these questions, but I'll ask them.
That's good, though.
Now, here's the question.
It's good to annoy you. No.
Why would God put a tree in the middle of a garden if he knew that they were going to look at it, and he knows all things, so he knows they're going to fail, they're going to eat from the tree? What kind of benevolent God would do that?
Now you're asking some good questions.
I mean, that seems like a malevolent God. He set them up for failure.
That's why dualism doesn't work.
Oh, boy. Is that the trail we're going to go down right now?
See, dualism,
we don't have to go down there.
No,
I have another response.
Okay.
And that is, these stories weren't written for you to ask those questions. These stories were written after the fact, years later, saying, how did we get here? How did all this begin? Well, you got to go back and let me tell you the story. The story's about this and this and this, and there was a tree, and the fruit was wonderful, and they disobeyed, and it's about the disobedience. It's about their choice, but it's not about God setting it up so they would fail, because the story was written for a purpose. It's like using an analogy, and the analogy breaks down. These ancient creation stories are meant to provide great truths that have withstood millennia.
Do you really?
I don't agree with that.
I was going to say, I think I would take issue with that. First of all, I don't think these people knew why they were writing these stories. I don't think they knew. I don't think they had a great explanation of, oh, well, we have these questions and therefore we're going to pass these stories down. I don't think it was that clear to them.
Well, I have one Hebrew word for that.
Oh, I love your Hebrew words.
Bereshit.
Well, you think it was they knew just on their own, in their own minds, why they were passing down these stories for generations, the significance of these stories. They were able to articulate that to themselves. They said, well, this is because we have these big life questions, so we're going to keep passing down these stories. I don't think they knew why. I think it was now this is just my opinion or my thought off the top of my head, but I think these things were way deeper and they just had to pass them down. That this narrative in some fashion of their history was so important to who they were and to carrying on their tradition and keeping them alive. There was an evolutionary component, a survivalist component to these things that was essential. And I don't think it was just necessarily that they had big questions that they were asking, and so they passed these down as answers to those. I don't think
that's what I'm saying.
It sounded like what you were saying.
Let me rephrase it. These ancient stories came through, and they have great intent for the stories to pass on a great truth. But the details of these stories break down if you try to make them say what they were not intended to say. If you want to go back in, if you want to watch a movie and you set up and you watch a movie and at the first scene of the movie you say, well, look, he's going to marry her. Why does he make this decision? If he just would not choose A and chose B, then the movie would be over in 2 seconds. The story has all these components to it, but the fact of some of these details are not the point of the story. God, for God did not put the tree. The story should not be analyzed as a point to why did God put the tree here. Now we can do it, but that's not the point of the story to go back and second guess the purpose of the story.
Well, what would you say then was the purpose of the story? Because I think that's where we're getting hung up.
I think these ancient stories, if they did not mean anything, then they would not have been passed down from generation to generation.
I agree with you.
But I don't think the stories came down, and then later they were edited by extremely intelligent people and put to print as we have them today in the best fashion that they could. I'm not saying that.
Do you have a silence mode on your phone, Brett?
I put it on
Mike,
silent.
If this was an iPhone, it would just be a switch on the side.
Yeah.
I did the opposite.
We're trying to discuss the significance of the biblical stories.
He's ragging me on my iPhone. Yeah, but
it's not my phone's fault. It's mine.
Agreed.
Everybody's checking their
personal
phones now
responsibility to make sure mine's off. But I think that when you look at these ancient stories, it's like an analogy, though. If I say, this is just like we did this yesterday, and you say, well, yesterday, though, I started here, and I didn't do this, and what had happened if I hadn't taken that decision? And you can play the what if all day long. You can play what if. Well, what if Adam and Eve had not eaten the fruit from the tree? What if then they'd still be in paradise? I go, yeah, and you'd never know the story.
Well, I think that's...
Right, and...
Go ahead.
Well... And not only that, you would, if this is humanity's story, which these primordial stories are,
agree.
Then we also wouldn't know what paradise even is. We wouldn't know we wouldn't have the distinctions that come along with what the quote fall brings between what we call good and what we call evil, or what we call pleasurable and what we call
but if I resolve the story, after the fact, I go back and I resolve the tension, the story has no meaning. I can go back and look at the detail of the story and say, well, why did God create a tree in the middle of the garden anyway? Well, guess what? If he hadn't, we wouldn't have a story.
Well, that's true.
I mean,
that's true.
Or the story wouldn't be very good.
No, it'd be very short, but you cannot go back and, my point is, you can't go back and look at all the details of the story and begin to say, well, this is inconsistent or that's inconsistent. The story has a life. Let the story be the story. Let the story teach what the story needs to teach, and don't superimpose values on the story that the story did not intend.
Right. So here's the problem that I have with that, unless I'm misunderstanding. This is a story that is mythic, and that means it's created very with a lot of metaphor, symbolism. It's very broad. It's painted in very broad strokes, and it seems like and mythic stories are created for the purpose of interpretation. So you have this general human experience that's given voice through these symbols, and then the individual can go to that symbolic story and find meaning for their own life as they interpret it in the context of their own life.
No, I agree with that. I agree with that. But you can't go back and second guess the story. That's my point. If you want to go back and second guess the story and say, well, why did God put the tree in the garden in the first place?
Okay, I think I know what you're saying now. Okay, so correct me if I'm wrong. What you're saying is that if you were, how I was brought up in the more conservative school that I went to, the conservative Christian school, is that, Adam ate from that tree, and then we all, that was the end of it. And if he would have just not eaten from that tree, then we'd all still be in paradise. And that's really where he messed up. He messed it up for all of us. And if we could all go back, and we know now that if he just wouldn't have eaten from that tree, then we'd have a completely different existence. We wouldn't need clothes. We wouldn't have death. We wouldn't have sin, all this stuff. That was the kind of story that was taught to me. Yeah, I think what you're saying is that's not the point of the story, is to say, Adam messed it up for everyone.
That's correct.
Okay.
Yes, I totally
agree with.
So, we can go back and say, this is the story, and Adam made a decision, and because of that, we have this explanation for disobedience in the world, and that's the point of this creation story. I think there are many other points in it, but if you go back and try to say, well, if Adam had not eaten the fruit, we'd be in a great place. No, you just rewrote the story. You can't rewrite it. You have to take it as it is. We have to take it from 2 or 4 or 5,000 years, and we look at the story as we have it, and we can't second guess the story. We can only, and I think this is what you're trying to say, we can only try to go in and try to interpret what the story meant then and what it's trying to meet through the generations. Yes. And I think where it gets abusive, and literally, is when we read it literally, it gets abusive. And I think when we second guess the story and we try to superimpose a meaning based on a second guessing. So I think that's what you were saying, Ryan.
Maybe I'm not understanding what you mean by second guessing. Because what comes to my mind is...
Well, let me explain second guessing. Second guessing is simply saying, if Adam had not eaten the fruit, we would live in utopia today. That's second guessing the story.
I think that there's value in asking those questions, honestly.
Why?
Well, the first thing that comes to my mind is it's interesting.
I got a Hebrew word for that.
It makes for a better podcast for sure.
Well,
if we ask those questions.
And so let's just think about this. Is there any validity to, like, Carl Jung's idea of the human unconscious, the collective unconscious, where that you have the collective experiences of humanity. Peterson would even say it's the collective experiences of all life that's handed down some way mysteriously through our DNA. And so that these, like you were saying earlier, the story kind of has to be told, even if they don't completely understand why it is that they're telling it. And so there can be a depth to the story that is not super obvious. And I think that that depth is uncovered when we begin to second guess. If maybe that's the wrong term.
I agree with you, and even Rita.
No, I agree with that too.
Rita, who's sitting behind me on the couch, there's her hand. She has this quote. I don't know who it was that said it originally, but that
editor-in-chief of Vogue Italia.
Oh, do you know what I'm saying? Can you give me the quote? Understanding often precedes expression.
Expression comes before understanding.
Expression often comes before understanding.
Yes.
And that's something that was from Vogue Italia, you said?
Yeah,
No, I agree with that, but I don't think we're communicating well here. But what I'm saying is you can't take an ancient story and make it say what it did not say. By that, I mean you can't change the story. The story is here.
Yes.
You can't go back and say, what if Adam had not eaten the fruit? Therefore, we would all be in utopia today. Just think, and let's go back, let's continue to spend all our lives blaming Adam for this mythological. You missed the point of the story.
But what about the? Well, go ahead.
No, go ahead, Brett.
Well, what if I approach it this way and I say, what if Adam hadn't eaten the fruit, and I start down that rabbit trail that the story isn't really focused on, obviously. But by that process, I begin to ask other questions that lead me to a place where I begin to see the value of, I start to see a value in him eating the fruit, or in humanity breaking away, disobeying, whatnot. So what would that value be?
Well, I think that gets you back to the story, ultimately. It gets you back to the truth of the story, which is he ate the fruit and there was a good reason for it.
Yes.
And maybe the reason was, you can simplify it and say it's because God put the fruit in the garden and he made it really good looking and it was inevitably going to be eaten or whatever. But I think the bigger question is, what came out of that? What's the significance of that part of the story? And I think what Brett's trying to say is reading into the story and asking those questions is important, because it takes you down that trail to where you can ask those questions and try to find the meaning.
Questions about life.
And I think what you're saying, Pastor, is that you don't want to, the story is the story.
That's correct.
It is what it is, in so many words.
That's not what I'm saying.
That is what you're saying.
But the story shouldn't have been any other way. It's the way it should be.
Right, and you can go back, and the thing is, you can go back and say, well, what if he had not done that? And you can play that game in your mind, but that is not the purpose of the story, for you to play that game. You can read I can ask the question, which I did. Why did he put the tree in the middle of the garden if he knew it was setting them up for failure? That's not the right question.
So
the right question is, why are there so many bad things in the world, or why this whole thing? And I think you say, well, I can tell you why, because the story passed down from my grandfather.
With all due respect, I don't think you get to say what are the right and wrong questions. I think that questions maybe they don't lead to answers, but they lead to better questions. And maybe starting with a bad question brings you to a point of asking a better question.
Well, part of education is understanding what the right question is and what the inappropriate question is.
I know, but that sometimes is a process for people to ask a series of bad questions to get to that. So I think that's the point. But let's ask this question, even though maybe you don't like it. What was the point of that tree, and why was it there? And what is the significance of Adam eating from that tree?
Well, you can't blame Adam, really.
It was the woman.
I think.
And then it was the snake.
I think that it comes back to the third truth that we were talking about a while ago. There's the breath, there's the heart, and there's the choice, or life, or brains, or you make decisions. Mm-hmm. And I think the point of the story is to show that all of a sudden they made a decision to eat the fruit. And then their eyes were opened. And I think from a Jungian approach would say, this is where the beginning of consciousness. Up till then, they were naked in the garden, and they were not ashamed. They were unaware. They had no thought about the future. Everything was utopia. But they made a choice. And once we make choices, it determines the outcomes. And I think that it's, and this is not just a story about a man and a woman. This is a story about humanity.
Yeah.
But I still would say I like to keep the story honest and true, and I think some people have usurped the story, and they get into hypothetical what could be, and they miss the whole point because they're dealing with the hypothetical so much that I keep wanting to draw them back. But this is the story we have, and I'm sure it has lots of meanings, but don't derail the story. And sometimes we superimpose our values on it, and I even could go back to Carl Jung or even a sociologist and say, but we look back through the lens of psychology on this story, and we try to find, and it may be authentic, but sometimes, even though you say this is what I think this story means, and it may very well have all those markers, but I don't know that the story necessarily
was intended
to satisfy a psychologist evaluation.
But then again, understanding often precedes expression.
Yeah, I think so.
And I think that part of...
I know you said that backwards.
Yeah.
Dang it.
Expression.
Whatever it is. Vogue lady.
Yeah.
Get read on the microphone. But I think I would ask the same question to you, though, Brett. What do you think the significance of that tree of knowledge of good and evil in the garden What is the significance there for you as you read into the story?
I guess the simplest way to explain what I think this illustrates is the choice, and given their choice, they experience this awakening. I do think that it's pointing to an awakening of sorts, that where they begin to understand that they are, it's interesting. Sorry, I'm jumping around, but at the end of chapter 2, it says they were both naked and yet felt no shame, right? Then when their eyes are open, they begin to feel shame, like they're less than. But the nakedness was there,
right,
in both cases. It was the awareness that changed. I think that means something. And it not only is that important, but then the choice to do what they were told not to do creates a world, at least that's what the story is saying. This world is now created that is, quote, fallen, and where they are experiencing differences between one thing and another, which is how, we know today that's how we assign value to things. We contrast them, we compare them to one another. And so it's as though the story is given expression to that deep human experience.
Yeah.
And it's seen as disobedience because God, who is this like ideal, has them, it tells them that they shouldn't do this, that they cannot, that they're forbidden, and then they do it anyway. But I think there is something to asking the question, well, then why is the tree right there? And why is the tree of life there? And why didn't they choose from the tree of life? I think there is some value in asking those questions.
Why?
Well,
Because I just asked why.
Because
but the point is, it's okay to ask, but you can't change the story.
No, I don't think that's what anybody's trying to do.
No,
is change
I agree.
The story.
You don't change
the story.
the story.
Is what the story is. We can all agree with that. I think we're not talking past each other on that anymore.
No.
And can I make a point from a kind of a Petersonian perspective?
Yeah.
Jordan Peterson perspective. If you don't know, Petersonian is a word that I just made up.
I like it.
But I think that one of the things that he kind of talks about is that there is a certain amount of need for a child. When you have a kid, you don't want to keep him at home for his entire life. At some point, that child has to go out, and they have to break some rules, and they have to do things their own way, so to speak. And I think a lot of parents probably get aggravated with their kids because they want to say, hey, why aren't you listening to me? Why aren't you listening to me? But if they don't go out and do something on their own and disobey, then it's like, well, you got to get out there and you got to try to do something. You got to become your own person. So I think that there's always this paradox. I'm not a parent, so I'm talking, very outside of my area of expertise here. But I feel like if you have a kid, you don't want them to stay home forever. And
Right.
you don't want them to just do everything that you ask them to do forever. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, you want them to listen to you. But you also want them to leave, and you want them to be strong and independent and able to take care of themselves and move out and do all that stuff. So you have this paradox of I need you to do your own thing and make your own decisions, but I also am aggravated because you're not doing what I told you to do. And so as humanity starts, in its young infant stage, moving out and disobeying and breaking the rules and doing all that stuff, we like to turn it into this, it shouldn't have happened that way or whatever. But no, there's a bigger tell to the story, which is that's the way that it was supposed to be. We were supposed to disobey. We're supposed to push the limits. We're supposed to walk out and become individuals and independent in some way and stronger in some way. And I think that's part of that story, and that's part of why that's there.
Or at the very least, it's an inevitability that we're going to disobey.
Yes.
If we are free in any sense of the word, that just seems like it's inevitable at some point. And so this story is expressing that inevitability.
Yeah.
Yeah, and
It's not that it's not disobedience. I think it is, but
no, I think it is. The story expresses that, and the theme of the story is the fall. Well, I think we all agree on that.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the whole theme. That it's this man was put in this situation and he fell. But I'm backing up just a little bit and say, but I am frustrated when someone goes back and says, well, why doesn't this happen? Why doesn't this happen? Why doesn't this happen? And they miss the whole point of the fall of the story. So if you want to rewrite the story, which I know we're not trying to do, but asking questions is always appropriate. But sometimes when you ask the question, it's not bad or right questions, like I said earlier, but sometimes you realize you're
That's
asking.
what I said earlier.
I know, but I'm repeating what you said. But I think sometimes you realize I was asking the wrong question, and I've asked the inappropriate question, or maybe I'm looking at the wrong point here. But when we understand what the theme of the story is, we go back and you can ask a million questions, but sometimes you go, boy, that was stupid. I mean, I was so far off beat. I was trying to make this, literal or a really historic story, and I realized that this is so much metaphor. It's so much truth in these stories that we glossed over for so many years. But the point of the fall is still the theme of the story, and you can find other things in it, but little nuggets and jewels. But
so can we talk quickly? We've been on this for a while. Can we jump to the idea of the garden and how that seems to be something that's reoccurring throughout the whole Bible, the whole biblical narrative? You see these garden accounts and these garden stories over and over again.
Well, and just we can talk about the garden. We also need to talk about the serpent. So, but we can talk about that briefly. Maybe we'll leave that even for next
I was going to
week.
say maybe we can touch on one of those, or maybe we just leave both of those. It's up to you.
Well,
you were saying this morning about the Garden of Gethsemane and how, am I saying that right?
Yeah.
And how the real temptation for Jesus was not in the desert, it was in the garden.
Right.
And how this garden motif seems to flow through in several different areas in the Bible. And there's obviously a lot of symbolism and a lot of importance in the garden, and the fact that we just made our own garden here, ironically,
Yeah.
a memorial garden.
So we can go and sit in the garden and have a point of reflection and evaluate things in life.
So what's the significance of the garden, would you say?
I think gardens, they often symbolize many things through ancient culture: innocence, provision, consciousness. I mean, you're in the garden, you're in a protected space, but there's a point to where everything you want is in the garden. It's a place of security and sustenance and safety, and he put man there. I mean, according to this story, but I think is this earthly paradise that we all dream that someday we're going to be in the garden, or we're trying to aspire to be there. And I think the irony is, and I'll talk about this in the teaching, is that I don't think man was designed to live in the garden. It's okay to dream about the garden, but once you were there, you realize this is not where I thrive and I stretch and I aspire. This is a place of comfort. It's like I hit the lottery and I'm going to sit on the couch forever. And I think people in that situation will die very unfulfilled.
Oh, and there's actually, that's true.
Yeah.
Using the lottery example is a great example, because I think in every single case, people that have won the lottery end up miserable and squandering.
Yeah.
And anyway, the garden is...
It's a good place to visit, and it's a good place to be on occasion and for a time. And I think that maybe in that sense, we all need to visit the garden maybe more often, or some of us more often and some of us less often, that there's a certain amount of comfort and rest and peace and reflection that can happen there in that space. But at the same time, you can't live there.
No,
you can't live in paradise. You can't be on vacation all the time, And
I think the garden has an external and internal component. You can go to the garden on the outside but still be troubled on the inside. Or you can be in a busy place and find your garden. I think
on the inside.
On the inside.
Yeah.
And I think those are amazing. But, we play with this garden theme. It's something that's not new. It's very ancient.
Oh, yeah.
And it's still used today. People, what are you doing? Something about putting my hands in the soil, and the gardening. It's about and growing a plant. And there's a whole gardening about flowers mean this part of your life, and vegetables mean this part of your life. And it depends on what kind of gardener you are, what you're trying to aspire to. But there's something very authentic about putting your hands in the atom in the dirt. And I think it's
well, and
The thing is, go ahead.
in the early garden story, everything's already there. The plants are already grown, and once they're kicked out of the garden, they have to go and turn up the soil and get hurt doing it, and it's hard work, and they have to find their own provision, so to speak.
Oh, yeah.
And
Yeah.
I think that's such an interesting thing that we still, even though we go out in the garden now, there's this combination of kind of, when we go to the garden, we know that we also have to tend to it.
Yeah, we have to tend it. We have to, and, in the story of in the Garden of Eden, the waters flowed into the garden. It had natural irrigation. It had natural plants. It had everything. Now, today, we'd go in there and we'd harvest that sucker.
Yeah.
We'd take all that stuff and bale it and pack it and send it off. I mean, we'd make money off the garden would be our goal. But I think the garden motif throughout ancient literature and even through contemporary culture, there's something about the garden that could be visited on a deeper level.
I think on a deep, fundamental way, what occurs there is the idea of the wilds of nature being brought into order so that the beauty of nature can be enjoyed without the dangers.
Yeah.
And in
That's
this
good.
garden
No.
story,
That's good.
God just provides all of that, but they have no way of knowing how beautiful it is until they're out of it.
Yeah, and I think it is another.
Yeah, that's really good.
And also I wonder, even in this passage, I'm asking one of those inappropriate questions that I complained about. They get down to the end of the garden, and God says among themselves, "Hey, we're going to have to kick them out of the garden, because if they stay, they're going to eat from the tree of life, and they'll become like one of us."
Yeah.
And I asked the question, wasn't I created in God's image to be like Him?
Yes.
And now I'm being kicked out of the garden because they're afraid that I'm going to be more like Him. I'm going to live forever. And the concept of immortality. There's all these different things that are in this story that are they're fun to look at and unpack. But as I say all that, I still have to come back and say, but I need to, at the end of the day, playing all those games I play, I come back and say, but I really need to not miss the main theme of the story. Because I can do that if I'm not careful. I can spend so many time in the weeds.
So
Weeds in the garden, sorry.
yeah. Well, let me ask one more thing before we close this out, because we're coming up on an hour. The church has invested in a memorial garden in the back, and you haven't really talked about it much. There's a few people that know about it, but it's been a work in progress for this little space to sit and reflect and to take time and all of that. Did you consciously think, I want to build a garden on this property to have something like that? Or how did that all come about? Can you kind of give us a little backstory and why that's a thing and why that's important?
Well, I think we have the space, and there are places, sometimes as a pastor, do a lot of funerals and cremations. And, we were finding a location in the back among the live oaks that could not be developed because it's near the wetland. And several people, it's just nice to put their ashes in the ground there. Mm-hmm. And someday I thought, well, maybe when I'm done, Suncoast has been my life investment. Maybe I'll put my ashes there. And then that's really began. That was step one. Step two was begin to realize that we all need a place where we can go for some time of contemplation and reflection. And there are times in my life where I need to steal away, and I need to talk. And I was telling my wife about this. I said, my brother died 3 years ago, and I long to go to the garden and talk with my brother Jimmy. She goes, that's kind of creepy. I said, I'm not really talking to him. I'm doing a psychological, getting some stuff off my chest, as if he were there. And just, it's okay to say, hey, I miss somebody.
Right.
And I think it's healthy to remember people and to remember the garden and to get in a place in your life where, hey, if you miss those moments, you miss the life grounding moments and also the nourishment to go forward.
Yeah.
It's a replenishment in the garden.
Yeah.
So this garden is a time of reflection, a place where I want people to go. And if they need a catharsis, I don't need one after this because I'm about to have one now, but to get through it to where you just say, I think it's healthy psychologically
Yeah.
to have this. And it's not like, it's this mystical. I'm praying to my brother who can hear me. I don't think that's necessarily true, but my heart needs to unload some issues, and the garden is a great place to be authentic and to come back to grips with who we are.
Yeah.
And that's something that's open to, the people in the community too,
Sure.
to be able to utilize.
Yeah, so they can slip out there. There's going to be a little box out there with tissues or benches out there right among the oaks. Pull in there and sit down and have a conversation with God or a conversation with yourself, or just a moment just to stop. Hey, I need to find a point of calmness and serenity, and this is a beautiful setting for that.
It really is.
So that's why we designed it. It wasn't necessarily one goal, but we hope it meets several goals. And besides that, I've done a couple of weddings there, which is it's a beautiful setting. I mean, it's a great setting for a wedding, and as long as you don't call it a funeral garden, it works.
Yeah.
But if you call it just a garden, people say, "Hey, can we do our wedding there?" Because it
really is a beautiful spot to
it's
do a
absolutely
wedding.
spectacular.
Yeah.
So
Well, with that, we're coming up on an hour, and this is our first podcast talking through the Hello World series, and it's been a lot of fun. Hopefully
Yes.
people don't get too bored or aggravated with our talking style. But this is a little behind the scenes of what it looks like to hash through some of these stories and do all this. So.
we'll see how it works on the weekend.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thanks.
All right.
Thanks.